We've been taught that agriculture is hard, that feeding a population requires backbreaking labor, that the history of civilization is the history of humans struggling against nature to coax sustenance from reluctant soil, plowing, planting, weeding, watering, harvesting, season after season of grinding effort just to produce enough food to survive. We accept this as the natural order, the unavoidable price of civilization. But what if it isn't true? What if there existed a system of food production so advanced, so sophisticated, so fundamentally different from what we practice today, that it fed millions with almost no effort at all? What if the agricultural struggle we've inherited isn't the natural state of growing food, but a catastrophic regression from something far better? I started this investigation by asking a simple question that nobody seemed able to answer. How did pre-industrial cities feed themselves? The more I researched, the more the official explanations collapsed. The numbers didn't work, the logistics were impossible, the infrastructure didn't exist, and yet the cities existed. The populations were fed, somehow. The answer, I believe, lies in what I call the Tartarian gardens, an agricultural system so different from modern farming that we literally can't recognize it when we see its remnants. A technology of food production that made the grinding labor of conventional agriculture unnecessary. The evidence is hiding in plain sight, in the grand conservatories that couldn't have served their official purpose, in the elaborate greenhouse structures that appeared in every major city, in the botanical gardens whose true function has been deliberately obscured, in the sophisticated understanding of plants and growing systems that was supposedly lost but may have been intentionally suppressed. Let me start with the feeding problem, because the scale of the impossibility is rarely appreciated. Consider London in 1800, a city of approximately 1 million people, the largest urban concentration in the world at that time. Each person requires roughly 2,000 calories per day to survive. 1 million people require 2 billion calories daily, 730 billion calories per year. Where did this food come from? The official answer is the surrounding countryside, farms within transport distance of the city producing grain, vegetables, meat, and dairy, a network of suppliers feeding the hungry metropolis. But the logistics of this explanation don't hold up. Transportation in 1800 meant horse and cart. Roads were primitive. Refrigeration didn't exist. Fresh food spoils quickly. The radius from which a city could practically draw fresh provisions was severely limited. Calculate the agricultural land within practical transport distance of London. Calculate the yields achievable with early 19th century farming techniques. Calculate the percentage of that yield that could survive transport to market in edible condition. The numbers fall short, dramatically short. The surrounding countryside simply couldn't produce enough food, move it fast enough, and deliver it fresh enough to feed 1 million people. Yet London existed. Its population grew. People ate. How? The standard historical response to this question involves a series of qualifications and complications. People ate less than we think. Malnutrition was common. The poor survived on minimal calories. The food supply was supplemented by imports. Preservation techniques extended the range of viable supply. Each qualification chips away at the impossibility. Together, they supposedly resolve it. But the qualifications create their own problems. If urban populations were chronically malnourished, how did they perform the intense physical labor that industrialization required? Malnourished workers can't operate factories 12 hours a day. If imports supplemented local supply, how were those imports transported across oceans without refrigeration? How did grain survive months at sea without spoiling? If preservation techniques extended viable supply ranges, what were those techniques? Salting and smoking work for some foods, but destroy others. You can't salt a tomato or smoke a lettuce. The explanations don't actually explain. They defer the problem without solving it. Something else was happening, something the official history doesn't acknowledge. Now consider the architectural evidence that historians prefer not to discuss. Every major 19th century city featured elaborate glass structures, conservatories, palm houses, crystal palaces, enormous buildings of iron and glass, often covering acres of ground. We're told these were ornamental, display spaces for exotic plants, symbols of imperial reach and botanical collection, expensive hobbies for wealthy societies showing off their mastery of distant nature. But examine these structures more carefully. Look at their scale, look at their sophistication, look at their distribution. The Palm House at Kew Gardens in London covers over 16,000 square feet. It maintains tropical temperatures year-round through passive solar heating and sophisticated ventilation. Its construction in 1848 required engineering capabilities supposedly at the cutting edge of possibility. Similar structures appeared simultaneously in cities across Europe and North America: Berlin, Paris, Vienna, New York, Boston, San Francisco, each city building elaborate glass houses of remarkable sophistication. Were all of these just ornamental? Were societies struggling to feed their populations really devoting enormous resources to displaying exotic plants? Or did these structures serve a more practical purpose? a purpose that has been deliberately obscured? The technology of these glass houses deserves examination. Modern greenhouses are relatively simple: glass or plastic panels, some form of heating, basic ventilation, growing spaces that extend the season and protect plants from weather. The 19th century conservatories were something else entirely. They featured sophisticated climate control systems that maintained specific temperature and humidity ranges without modern technology, ventilation systems that circulated air through complex pathways, heating systems that distributed warmth evenly across enormous spaces, irrigation systems that delivered water to plants through methods we still don't fully understand. The engineering was extraordinary, and it appeared simultaneously in cities around the world, as if implementing a pre-existing design rather than independently developing solutions. Where did this technology come from? How did societies supposedly struggling with basic industrial processes suddenly master sophisticated climate engineering? The official story credits visionary engineers and determined horticulturalists, innovation driven by the Victorian passion for botanical collection. But innovation doesn't work that way. It develops gradually, with false starts and failures. It doesn't appear fully formed in multiple locations simultaneously, unless it wasn't innovation at all, unless it was inheritance. Technology passed down from a more advanced predecessor, implemented by people who didn't fully understand what they were building. The botanical gardens themselves raise similar questions. Every major city established botanical gardens during the 1800s. We're told these served scientific purposes, cataloging plant species, supporting medical research, educating the public about natural diversity. But the scale and design of these gardens suggests something more. They weren't just collections of interesting plants. They were sophisticated growing systems featuring multiple microclimates, advanced irrigation, and deliberate arrangements that optimized plant health and productivity. The Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew cover over 300 acres. They contain not just display beds, but extensive growing operations, propagation facilities, seed banks, research stations. Similar botanical gardens appeared in cities around the world: Melbourne, Sydney, Singapore, Cape Town, Montreal, each featuring the same combination of display spaces and productive facilities. Were these really just scientific institutions, or were they the visible remnants of a much larger agricultural system? What if the botanical gardens we visit as tourists were once the centers of urban food production? What if the conservatories and glass houses weren't ornamental at all, but were the infrastructure of a sophisticated growing technology? The Tartarian agricultural system, as I've reconstructed it from fragmentary evidence, operated on principles entirely different from conventional farming. Modern agriculture fights nature. We clear land, eliminating existing ecosystems. We plant monocultures, single crops covering vast areas. We add fertilizers to replace nutrients we've depleted. We spray pesticides to kill organisms that would naturally control our crops. The result is productive in the short term, but destructive in the long term. Soil depletion, ecosystem collapse, increasing dependence on chemical inputs, a system that requires ever more effort to maintain ever more precarious yields. The Tartarian approach, if the evidence is interpreted correctly, worked with nature rather than against it. Instead of clearing land, they created growing environments. The conservatories and glass houses weren't just shelters from weather. They were complete ecosystems, closed or semi-closed systems where plants, insects, microorganisms, and environmental factors work together to produce abundance. Instead of monocultures, they practice sophisticated polyculture, multiple species growing together, each supporting the others. Nitrogen-fixing plants enriching soil for heavy feeders, pest-repelling species protecting vulnerable crops, ground covers retaining moisture and suppressing weeds. Instead of fighting the natural cycles that govern plant growth, they optimize them, understanding exactly which conditions produce maximum yield with minimum input, creating environments where plants practically grew themselves. The energy systems we've documented in previous investigations would have been central to this agricultural technology. Plants need light. The sophisticated glass structures captured and concentrated solar energy, creating growing conditions more intense than natural sunlight. Plants need warmth. The atmospheric energy technology apparently provided heating without fuel, maintaining optimal temperatures regardless of external weather. Plants need water. The evidence suggests sophisticated irrigation systems that collected, purified, and distributed water with minimal human intervention. And plants need nutrients. Here the technology becomes most interesting. Modern hydroponic systems, grow plants without soil, delivering nutrients directly to roots through water solutions. We consider this advanced technology developed in the 20th century, but descriptions of the 19th century conservatory operations include references to growing systems that sound remarkably similar. Plants grown in water rather than soil, nutrients delivered through circulation systems, roots suspended in oxygenated solutions. Were the Tartarians practicing hydroponics before we supposedly invented it? Did their conservatories feature growing technology we've only recently rediscovered? But the elaborate plumbing systems visible in surviving conservatory structures suggest exactly this: pipes and channels and reservoirs whose purpose has been explained as ornamental fountain supply, but whose distribution matches productive growing systems more than decorative water features. The scale of potential production from such systems is difficult for modern minds to grasp. Conventional farming produces perhaps a few tons of vegetables per acre per year. The yield depends on weather, soil quality, pest pressure, and numerous other factors outside the farmer's control. Controlled environment agriculture, using modern technology, can produce 50 to 100 times conventional yields. The same acre, covered with a sophisticated greenhouse, produces as much food as 100 acres of open field. If Tartarian conservatory technology matched or exceeded modern controlled environment capabilities, the implications are staggering. A single large conservatory could produce as much food as a substantial farm. A network of conservatories distributed across a city could feed its entire population from structures covering a tiny fraction of the land that conventional agriculture would require. The grand conservatories that appeared in every major city weren't just capable of feeding urban populations. They were designed to feed urban populations. The ornamental explanation is a cover story for structures whose true purpose was urban food production. This interpretation explains anomalies in the historical record that otherwise make no sense. How did cities grow so large before modern transportation made long-distance food supply practical? They fed themselves locally, through conservatory systems that produced enormous yields in small spaces. Why did every major city invest in elaborate glass structures during the same period? They weren't independently developing the same hobby. They were implementing the same agricultural system. Why do surviving descriptions of 19th century conservatories mention production facilities alongside display spaces? Because production was the primary purpose. Display was the cover story. Why did botanical gardens feature such sophisticated infrastructure? Because they weren't just collecting plants. They were growing food. The pieces fit together once you abandon the assumption that these structures were ornamental. Everything makes sense once you recognize them as agricultural infrastructure. The destruction of this system would have been catastrophic. If cities depended on conservatory networks for food production, destroying those networks would mean destroying the food supply. Populations that had fed themselves through sophisticated local agriculture would suddenly face starvation. The famines that appear throughout 19th century history take on new significance in this light. The Irish potato famine of the 1840s killed over 1 million people and displaced millions more. The official explanation blames a potato blight that destroyed the crop that Irish peasants depended on. But Ireland had more than potatoes. It had extensive agricultural resources. The blight alone shouldn't have caused famine on such a scale, unless the blight was accompanied by something else: the destruction of agricultural infrastructure that had supplemented conventional farming, the loss of conservatory systems that had helped feed the population. Similar famines occurred across Europe and Asia during the same period. Russia, India, China, millions dying from food shortages that official history struggles to explain given the agricultural resources supposedly available. What if these famines weren't natural disasters? What if they were the consequence of deliberate destruction? The elimination of Tartarian agricultural technology, leaving populations dependent on primitive farming methods that couldn't sustain them. The transition from Tartarian agriculture to conventional farming would explain the rural depopulation that characterized the 19th century. We're told that industrialization drew workers from farms to factories. The efficiency of agricultural machinery meant fewer farmers were needed. Rural populations migrated to cities in search of factory work. But this narrative has causation backwards. If urban conservatory systems were destroyed, cities would suddenly need food from conventional sources. Demand for farm products would explode. But conventional farming is labor-intensive. Producing enough food through primitive methods requires enormous human effort. The rural depopulation might not reflect workers choosing to leave farms. It might reflect workers being forced onto farms. The desperate attempt to replace lost conservatory production with brute agricultural labor. The timeline supports this interpretation. The Great Famines preceded the Great Migrations. People starved. Then they moved, not because factories offered opportunity, but because destroyed agricultural systems left them no choice. The knowledge of Tartarian agriculture would have been suppressed along with other dangerous technologies. We've documented in previous investigations the systematic erasure of Tartarian science and engineering. The witnesses institutionalized, the records destroyed, the alternative histories pathologized. Agricultural knowledge would have been a primary target. If people understood how the old systems worked, they might try to rebuild them. They might refuse to accept the grinding labor of conventional farming when they knew another way was possible. The suppression appears in how botanical knowledge was restructured during the 19th century. Before this period, plant knowledge was practical. Herbalists and gardeners understood how to grow food, make medicine, and work with nature productively. Their knowledge was experiential, passed down through practice and apprenticeship. The new botanical science that emerged was theoretical. Classification systems, Latin names, academic study divorced from practical application, knowledge that lived in universities rather than gardens. This transition is usually presented as progress, the advancement from primitive folk knowledge to sophisticated science. But what if the transition served a different purpose? What if academic botany replaced practical knowledge precisely because practical knowledge was dangerous? Because people who understood how to grow food efficiently couldn't be controlled through food scarcity? The botanical gardens that had been productive centers became display spaces and research institutions. The conservatories that had fed cities became ornamental luxuries. The practical knowledge of Tartarian agriculture was replaced by theoretical knowledge that couldn't threaten the new order. Traces of the old knowledge survive in unexpected places. The biodynamic agriculture movement, founded in the 1920s, incorporates principles that seem bizarre from a conventional scientific perspective. Planting by lunar cycles, treating soil as a living organism, understanding farms as complete ecosystems rather than production facilities. These principles are dismissed as mysticism by mainstream agriculture, but they align remarkably well with what the evidence suggests about Tartarian growing methods. Working with natural systems rather than against them, understanding the energetic dimensions of plant growth, creating conditions where abundance arises naturally rather than being forced through effort. The permaculture movement, developed in the 1970s, rediscovered many of the same principles, designing growing systems that maintain themselves, stacking functions so each element serves multiple purposes, minimizing input while maximizing output through intelligent design. Permaculture practitioners regularly achieve yields that conventional farmers consider impossible, gardens that produce abundant food with minimal labor, systems that improve over time rather than depleting. Were these movements recovering lost knowledge? Were their founders somehow accessing understanding that had been deliberately suppressed? The patterns in their methods match the patterns suggested by Tartarian agricultural evidence. The principles work in practice even though they shouldn't according to conventional theory. Something about this knowledge persists, despite suppression, despite ridicule, despite the determined effort to make people forget that another way is possible. The urban farms and community gardens that have proliferated in recent decades may represent intuitive recovery of Tartarian principles. People in cities feel drawn to grow food, not because they need to economically. Modern urban dwellers can easily buy food, but because something about growing plants satisfies a need that modern life doesn't meet. Urban growing spaces routinely produce yields that surprise their creators. Small plots generating abundance that seems disproportionate to their size. Gardens thriving despite conditions that should prevent success. The explanations offered are usually dismissive. Beginner's luck, favorable microclimates, the enthusiasm of new gardeners compensating for lack of expertise. But what if urban spaces simply grow food better than rural farms? What if cities, with their concentrated human energy and modified environments, actually provide superior growing conditions? The Tartarian conservatories were urban. Their agricultural system was city-based. Perhaps there's something about urban environments that support sophisticated food production in ways we don't consciously understand. The glass houses that survive are being rediscovered for productive purposes. Across Europe and North America, abandoned conservatories are being restored, not as heritage sites or tourist attractions, but as working, growing spaces. Urban farms occupying structures that haven't produced food in over a century, and they're producing, remarkably, yields that exceed expectations. Growing seasons that extend far beyond what the climate should allow. Crops thriving in conditions that should limit them. The structures remember their purpose. The engineering that made them productive still functions. The glass houses still want to grow food, and when people give them the chance, they perform. This isn't mysticism, it's practical observation. The conservatories were designed as growing systems. Their design optimizes growing conditions. When used for growing, they work better than modern structures built for the same purpose. We're accidentally rediscovering what was deliberately hidden. The productive capacity that ornamental interpretations obscured is becoming visible again. What would it mean to fully recover Tartarian agricultural technology? Imagine cities that feed themselves, urban conservatories producing fresh food year-round, walking distance from every resident, no long-distance transportation, no industrial processing, no supply chains vulnerable to disruption. Imagine agriculture without back-breaking labor, growing systems that maintain themselves, harvests that practically gather themselves, food production requiring a few hours per week rather than dawn-to-dusk grinding. Imagine abundance without destruction, farming that improves soil rather than depleting it, production that enhances ecosystems rather than eliminating them. Agriculture that heals the planet rather than devastating it. This isn't fantasy. It's what the evidence suggests actually existed. The Tartarian gardens fed millions with minimal effort. The technology worked. The system functioned, and it could function again. The principles aren't lost, just suppressed. The knowledge isn't gone, just obscured. The structures still stand in many cities, waiting to be used for their designed purpose. The recovery begins with seeing what's actually there. The grand conservatories in your city weren't ornamental luxuries. They were agricultural infrastructure. The botanical gardens weren't just scientific collections. They were productive growing systems. The elaborate glass houses that dot the urban landscape weren't expressions of Victorian whimsy. They were the remains of a food system that made modern agriculture look primitive. Once you see them for what they were, you can't unsee it. The iron frameworks designed to support maximum glass exposure, the ventilation systems engineered for climate control, the irrigation infrastructure integrated into the design, the microclimates created through sophisticated environmental manipulation. These weren't decorative choices, they were functional requirements, engineering decisions made to optimize food production in urban environments. The Tartarians solved urban agriculture. They created systems that fed cities without farms. They developed technology that made conventional farming obsolete. And when their civilization fell, that technology was rebranded as ornamental. The conservatories are still there, waiting. Some are maintained as heritage sites, their productive capacity forgotten. Some are abandoned, their glass broken and their frames rusting. Some have been demolished, their irreplaceable engineering destroyed to make room for parking lots. But many survive, and every one of them contains the potential to produce food on a scale that would astound modern urban planners. A single large conservatory, properly operated, could feed thousands of people. A network of conservatories could make a city entirely food self-sufficient. The technology exists, the infrastructure exists, the knowledge, though suppressed, persists in fragments and can be recovered. What doesn't exist is the will to use it, because food self-sufficiency threatens power structures built on food control. Because abundant local production undermines systems that profit from scarcity and distance. Because the Tartarian gardens represent a world where people aren't dependent on systems they don't control. The Tartarian workday involved minimal agricultural labor. Because Tartarian agriculture required minimal labor. The Tartarian cities fed themselves. Because Tartarian technology made self-feeding simple. The Tartarian world functioned differently because Tartarian systems made different functioning possible. We inherited the ruins of that world. We were told the ruins were ornamental. We were taught that the grinding agricultural labor we endure is natural and inevitable. But the conservatories tell a different story. The botanical gardens tell a different story. The glass houses and palm houses and crystal palaces tell a different story. They tell the story of a civilization that solved the food problem, that created abundance without effort, that fed millions through technology so sophisticated we've forgotten it was technology at all. The Tartarian gardens existed, the evidence surrounds us, and the knowledge, though hidden, can be recovered, because the glass houses still stand, and they're still waiting to feed us.